or children. Exodus chapter 3, if you have a Bible, go ahead and grab those. You're going to Exodus chapter 3, the second book of your Bible. If you need a Bible, there should be some on the chairs there around you. Page 62 is where you're going. Page 62, as we're continuing on in our preaching through the scriptures this morning, the books of the Bible, we are switching from the first book, Genesis, and moving on to Exodus this morning. You feel that, don't you? Fire is one of those mesmerizing things, isn't it? Now, I would have liked to have brought a fire pit in here. But there's a few of you in here who would have really frowned on that for different reasons, I'm sure. But, well, my fire died out. Well, it may get going again here. But it's one of those mesmerizing things, isn't it? Where it's one of those things that draws us in. We can stare at it, and we can stare into it for hours at a time. And yet, if we get too close, it'll burn us. Right? It's around fires that deep philosophical discussions take place. And then if you stay around those fires long enough, maybe the philosophical gives way to the delusional. It's one of those things that it brings people together, and yet it also makes us aware of our limitations. I should not put my hand in that fire. I should not get into my mind that I should leap over that fire as the night goes on. That's a good indicator the night needs to end, right? But fire reminds me that I am limited because I can be burned, I can be consumed, it can inflict pain on me, and yet it's also one of those things that it can provide warmth. It can provide light. It can be used for protection. It's one of those things that just intrigues us. And if you have a child, particularly I think boys, not to stereotype, but boys tend to be pyromaniacs from birth, right? I mean, I got in trouble as a kid for doing pyromaniac type things in the house. I'm not going to tell you because some of you in here might get some ideas, right? But my little kids already are drawn to fire, but my little boy is particularly drawn to that. Now, he's not lighting matches yet. But there's something about when we light that fire, he goes to it, and you see that hand just reaching out. You take that hand back, right? Fire is one of those things. So is it any wonder then that God would choose fire as a way to reveal himself to humanity? And he does so often. And so in these verses this morning, Angela kicked us off by reading these verses. That's what we see, is God starts to reveal himself to a guy named Moses through a burning bush. But before we get there, we need to catch up a little bit. Because when Genesis ended and before Exodus started, now in your Bible, it's a mere turn of the page. Perhaps. It might not even be a turn of the page. It might just be look from the left side now to the right side. That's 400 years. In simply turning that page. That is, Joseph ending Genesis with his brothers, and his dad dies living in the land of Egypt with him, and Joseph's brothers and he are living in the land, and Joseph will die. And then Exodus picks up, summarizes a little bit of what took place in Genesis, who from Jacob's family went there, but then we are told early on that now there was a new king in Egypt, a new Pharaoh. And this was a Pharaoh who did not look favorably upon the people of Israel, upon Joseph's family. He did not know Joseph. He was far enough removed from Joseph that he was not showing kindness. In fact, he looked at the people of Israel living in that land of Goshen, and they had begun to multiply. No longer were they about 70 people. They had started to grow to hundreds of thousands of people. And God told Jacob he would do that. I'm going to grow you there in the land, in Egypt. And God had been doing that. And so some 400 years have taken place, and this king is threatened by these people that are growing and becoming numerous. And he thinks if we don't squash that, they're going to try to revolt and overthrow us. So he puts them into slave labor. You know the story. You've probably watched The Prince of Egypt. There's some good stuff in that, right? And so you know the story. If from nothing else, you know it from that. And so this king puts them enslaved, and then he wants all the male kids that are being born, he wants them put to death. because that's going to be the way he's going to end the population growing. You know that there were some midwives who were delivering that he told them, hey, let us know when there's some male babies being born so that we can get to them. But there were some particular midwives who were faithful and who they would help hide these kids. And one of those kids we're introduced to is Moses. And Moses' mother keeps him for a couple months while she nurses him. And then when it's time for him to no longer nurse, or when she feels like it is going to be a threat because people are going to notice him, she puts him in a basket, puts him in the river, and floats him off, only to be found by Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter sees this kid. Something about this kid indicates that he is a Hebrew child, perhaps the fact that he's in a basket floating down the river, not a van by the river, but a basket down by the river. Sorry, it went through my head, okay? But that's a dangerous criteria to just say things. All right, so here he is floating down this basket, and this daughter of Pharaoh takes him out, and then Moses' sister's watching by, sees her, and she goes up to Pharaoh's daughter and says, would you like me to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child? Yes, that'd be great. Great. Moses' mom is picked to go and nurse her own son. Isn't that great? Right? And then Pharaoh's daughter raises her, and Moses is raised in the house of the Pharaoh, educated according to the best education of the time in the land. This would be a private school education, not private Christian school education, but private school education, right? Not everybody got the type of education Moses got. And then Moses is one day among his people as he's still living in the palace, and he's among his people, the Hebrews, the Israelites. And he sees them being mistreated. And he intervenes, and in intervening, he accidentally kills an Egyptian. And the next day, he comes back to his people because they're fighting, and he tries to intervene among his people. Hey, stop fighting. And they turn on him and say, you're going to kill us like you did the Egyptian. And then you know the story from there. He goes on the run. He runs out of Egypt, away from the family that's raised him, and he runs into the land of Midian, the desert. He's 40 years old at that point. And he's running away from the life that he has known. 40 years old, and he is now running away from all he has ever known. We pick up in Exodus chapter 3, and it has been another 40 years. Moses is now 80 years old. He's been shepherding. He's spent the last 40 of his years going from living in a palace, being raised in the family of the Pharaoh, to now living among livestock and among sheep. Smelly, stinky, a hard job. Sometimes little sleep. It requires you to travel quite a bit so you can go where the livestock needs to graze. It's quite a contrast to the way he was living and the way he'd grown up. And yet, for the last 40 years, he's now 80 years old. And as he's going about bringing the livestock to a place of grazing, perhaps a place that was normal for him to bring them. Maybe it was a seasonal location that he went to. But while he's there, in verses 1 through 5 is where we see he sees this burning bush. And so you can look with me there in verse 3. So Moses thought, after seeing this bush that's burning and it's not being consumed, he says, I will turn aside to see this amazing sight. Why does the bush not burn up? Moses is curious. And I think that's something we all need to keep when it comes to things of God. We need to stay curious. When we see something that looks out of the ordinary, it looks like this is not something that normally happens, we should be curious. Is God doing something in this? Or sometimes we see something and it's out of the ordinary. Instead of moving towards it out of curiosity to investigate and say, God, is this you? Instead, we run away from it because we don't feel safe. We run away from it because we don't feel comfortable. But Moses looks at it and he goes, that bush is burning and it's not being consumed. I think I'm going to go see why. And good thing he did. Because it's in being curious, it's in him going to see what happened with that bush that God is able to now reveal himself to Moses in a way that maybe he would not have been able to before. So verse 4, when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from within the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. And before we move on from that verse, Moses is 80 years old. He spent 40 of the last years hiding out in the desert among a people that's not his own, learning a new trade, a new job, a new career that's not the one he was raised in, living a life that far goes below the standard that he had grown up with. And yet when God calls to him, Moses, his response is, here I am. It's a response of obedience. At 80 years old, you're not too old to stop obeying God. In fact, there's no age that you reach where you're too old to stop obeying God. Some of you, you really get this, and I'm so thankful for you because here you are. You're not quite 80 perhaps, or maybe you're past 80, but you've been in the church for years, and you're continuing to be faithful as you invest in others, and you're teaching people, you're training people, you're discipling people, you're leading people, and you've not quit obeying the Lord as you've grown and aged. And the temptation could be there for you to say, I've served my time. I spent years in this field, or I've spent years in this field. I've spent years giving, and you could sit back and you could say it's time for the next generations to step up. But so many of you have faithfully continued to invest in the younger generations, and I'm grateful for you, and I want you to continue that. You need to continue that because these younger generations, my generation, the ones coming below me, we need that. Otherwise, guess what happens? We're left to figure it out on our own and blaze a path that maybe we're going to go off on this way and then we're going to go off on this way. But if you come alongside of us and you continue to obey the Lord in discipling and investing us, then some of those sidetracks may not happen and we get further faster. I'm thankful for you, for those of you that are doing that. Thank you. Keep doing that. Moses is 80 years old. He says, here I am. There's that fire. We go to verse 5. Moses is moving towards the bush. God says, do not approach any closer. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. So before we go any further, Moses, stop. Don't come any nearer. You remember the fire? Fire is that mesmerizing. It draws us in, and yet if we get too close, it burns us. Moses, don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, Moses. Because the ground that you're about to walk on, that's holy ground. The very dust on your sandals that you've been tracking, it has no place here as you approach me. I'm not a wear flip-flops in public type of guy. It's not a judgment on anyone else. It's a personal preference. I wear flip-flops when I go to the pool or the beach, right? But there was a season of my life, a very short one, freshman in college, where my first semester as a freshman in college, I decided I'm going to do something different. See, I was the guy in high school that I wore Dockers and I wore button-down shirts to class. Now, my time, they called me a prep, right? I was that kind of person. That's how I dressed, right? Now, there was a season, my first semester as a freshman in college, I said, I'm going to change who I am. I'm going to change the way I live, and so I started wearing Holy jeans, because after all, I was at Houston Baptist University. And so I would wear Holy jeans to class with flip-flops. Now, that was just a different motive. But then that same season, I started to lead worship at a church that I had grown up in. It was a denominational, liturgical church that was very traditional. No contemporary service at all. And so I wanted to help start a service. So I was helping to start a service. It did not go well. It didn't take off. My family were the only people who attended. But I had a large family, 6 kids, so it was well attended. But when I would lead at that service, I was in my flip-flop stage. I would take my flip-flops off, and I would lead barefoot. Now, in my mind, what I'm thinking is holy ground. I want to communicate holy ground. Now, I don't do that anymore, obviously. But in my mind, that's what I say. And I got it from something like this. In my mind, as I'm leading worship, I'm thinking to myself, I want to make sure I'm approaching the Lord rightly. So what can I do? Sometimes, and it's not even really about the physical, taking the shoes off, it's not a requirement. You don't have to take your shoes off. But sometimes the physical posture in the way we worship is what directs our heart. And sometimes when I'm unwilling to do something physically that might direct my posture, what happens is pride gets a hold of me. And so for me, when I would take my shoes off now, I'm not a foot guy. I don't like feet. I don't like my feet being seen by people. I wore my pie socks today. Right? And so for me, that was a vulnerable thing. It was a humiliating thing. Like foot washing services, you might as well just put me to death somewhere else in some other way. I can't stand. I had to wash my kids' feet yesterday because they were muddy from playing in the yard. And I found myself at one point going, this is nasty. And all I was doing with the towel was drying it off, but just feet. And so for me, that was something. But when it comes to God, there's things about us that are common, that are normal, that we must not approach God with that same commonality, with that same casual approach. We must not approach God casually. And so Moses, don't come any closer. Take off your shoes. Take off your sandals. Because where you are standing is holy ground. Now listen, that ground was not holy before God appeared there. That ground became holy because God appeared there. Where God's presence is, that place becomes holy. Because God is holy, wherever he is becomes holy. God does not become holy because of what he does. God does not become holy because people ascribe worship to him. No, God is holy, therefore he does holy things. God is holy, therefore people worship him as holy. You see the difference? The order is incredibly important. Moses, don't come any closer because the ground that you're standing on, that's holy ground. Verse 6, he says, I'm the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. This is the first time that we are made aware of that God reveals himself to Moses. He had revealed himself to Abraham. He had revealed himself to Isaac. He had revealed himself to Jacob. And now, 400 years later, he's revealing himself to Moses. Moses, I'm the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. I'm the God of the promise. I'm the God of your people. And Moses is now seeing God in that light, and he's frightened because fire. It's like fire. It mesmerizes us. It draws us in, but you don't get too close. God's not like a porcupine. That's different, right? But you've got to respect and revere that God is not like you. He's like us in that we bear his image and there's some similarities to us, but he's not like us in that he is altogether different. He's creator. He's perfect. He's sinless. In him, there is no darkness at all. There's only light. And so as we approach God, as we worship God, as we can commune with God, as we talk with God, we must not just approach God casually as we would one another. There must be a reminder constantly in the forefront of our minds. God is holy. Verse 7, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. Some 400 years. That's well long enough for people to go, God, have you forgotten us? That's well long enough for people to go, maybe it's just myth, what's been passed on to us. Maybe the God that our fathers and our mothers have passed down to us, and they've told us stories about how that God revealed himself to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Maybe that God is just made up. Maybe that God's not all powerful like we thought. Maybe that God's no longer around. 400 years is a long time. For some of you, a week might feel like a long time. And you go wondering, God, do you see me? Do you see the injustice? God, do you see the way this person's treating me? Do you see the bullying that's taken place? God, do you hear the words that they're saying? And those words are going down deep like morsels, and they're just going to plant themselves in me and bear roots. God, do you see? Do you hear? God, do you see the injustice going on in the world? God, do you see? Do you hear? Some of you perhaps are wondering, does God see you? And he does. Does God hear your cries? He does. You see, if I was in Israel for those 400 years and I lived somewhere in that time period, I might be thinking, God, where are you? But I don't have the bigger picture. I don't have the picture that through those 400 years, God was growing a people. God was building a nation. It was like an incubator there in Egypt. And so that God was still actively working on fulfilling his promises to Abraham, where he says, I will make you a great nation. Dramatic, drop the remote. Got to get that. We won't be able to go further without that. And so God says to him, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I know their sorrows. Verse 8, I have come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a land that is both good and spacious, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the region of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now indeed the cry of the Israelites has come to me. And I have also seen how severely the Egyptians oppress them. So now go. I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. God says to Moses, I've seen, I've heard, and it's time for me to act. I'm sending you, Moses. Moses says in verse 11, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, or that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Moses has an identity crisis in that moment. God says, I'm sending you back to Egypt. Now remember, for Moses, that's a big deal. He's 80 years old. He's been out of Egypt for 40 years. He left as a fugitive. Now the king that was on the throne when he left has been dead, and there's a new king now. And God is saying, I'm sending you back, and I'm going to deliver the people through you. And Moses says, but who am I? Because the last 40 years have done a number on Moses. Moses is wondering, God, I'm not capable of doing what you're asking me to do. Moses perhaps saying, I don't want to do what you're asking me to do. Who am I? And maybe you felt like that when God is asking you to do hard things. Maybe that hard thing is, I just need to stand up for what I believe here in the workplace. It maybe in my family, I need to be the voice that speaks for God in the midst of my family who wants nothing to do with God. Maybe you're the one who God is saying, I want you to invite this person to dinner, to your house. I want you to ask them to come to church with you. I want you to just go and speak to them and ask them if there's anything that you can pray for them about, whatever the case may be. And maybe it's even bigger than all those things. And maybe you go, but God, who am I? What am I going to say when I get there? What am I going to say if I invite them over? What am I going to say if when I go and ask them if I can pray for them, they actually have something? What am I going to say? Who am I? I think every one of us at some point, if we haven't already, will have a moment or moments like this where we go, God, who am I to lead this ministry, to invest in these people, to take on this role? You know who I am, God? Do you know what goes on in here? It's funny, I didn't plan this. Two of you asked me this morning, what do you think, Justin? I said that's a dangerous question, right? Because it depends on when you ask me. Right? I had a professor friend who used to ask me, what do you know? I hated that question. Because how you answer a question like, what do you know? Well, I know a lot or I don't know a lot. Depends on what you're asking me, right? What do you think, Justin? I don't know. Depends on the moment, because if you ask me in one moment, I might be thinking something that would frighten you. If you ask me another moment, maybe it'll impress you. I don't know. Who am I? Moses says, who am I? More significantly, look at God's answer. Verse 12, he replied, surely I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you and they will serve God at this mountain. God's answer to Moses' question, who am I, is I will be with you. But God, who am I? I will be with you. You see, you might expect God to say, Moses, you're fearfully and wonderfully made. Moses, you have been so specially created and formed. I've known you from the womb. Moses, you have been specially prepared for this time, those years in Egypt, these years shepherding. Moses, you are who you would expect maybe God to say something like that. And instead, who am I? God's answer is, I'll be with you. When God's presence is with you, it makes little difference who you are. If you're wrestling with, who am I, God, that you would ask me to go back to my family? Who am I, God, that you would ask me to go back into this job? God, who am I that you would ask me to stand firm on this? God, who am I that you would ask me to invest in this person? God, who am I that you would ask me to lead in this way? God's answer to you is, I will be with you. And that's enough. Because when God is with you, it makes little difference who you are. But if God says in answer to your who am I will be with you, it's really important who God is. Because it's not okay for us to go into something and not know who God is and not have an accurate picture of who he is, or to take our own conception of God and say, I'm okay with you coming with me if you're like this, God. And so God goes on to reveal himself to Moses. So verse 13, he says, Moses said to God, if I go to the Israelites and tell them the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I say to them? Who should I tell them sent me, God? Like, I could show up to these people in Egypt, and Egypt worships multiple gods. And I grew up in the palace of Egypt. And so when I come and I say the God of your fathers has sent me, they're going to want to know, do I know the God of their fathers? Because after all, I grew up in Egypt, in the palace, with Pharaoh and his kids. So who should I tell them sent me? What is your name? God said in verse 14. God said to Moses, I am that I am. God's name that he reveals to Moses is a verb. It's a verb. It's the to be verb. It's the I am, or he is, or she is. It's we are. It's that verb. And God reveals himself first in the first person. I am. Ekia, Hebrew. Ekia, I am. More commonly, we get to know it as Yahweh. Third person, he is. But oftentimes that gets used for I am. God says, I am who I am. That's my name. I am. There's been a lot of discussion about this. What does it mean? What does it not mean? And here's some things that we can definitely pull away from when God says, I am. And if you were just to go home and think about this, or kick this around in your community group or your discipleship group and say, what does it mean that God's name, as he reveals himself, is I am? And just meditate on that, stew on that, I am. Well, it means he currently is. It means he exists. It means he's present. It means he's active. It's important that he didn't say I was, because that would imply a beginning or an end. He says I am, which means he always has been. I am. So at any point in time that we would know as time, if we were to ask God, what's your name? He would say, I am. I just am. God has always been in existence. Never created, never to end. He's eternal. I am. He's over all things. I am. He's presently active in things. I am. Some people have said that behind the verb that's translated I am, there's a causative nature. And so it could be translated, I cause to be what I cause to be. I bring things about. I orchestrate things. I am the God of history. I am the God of creation. I bring about things. I am. Moses says, I am, or Ekia, Yahweh. He says, you must say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. And God said to Moses, you must say to the Israelites, the Lord. So just so for your awareness, where it says I am in verse 14 and I am in verse 14 again, those are the first person, Ekia. But from there forward, it's translated Yahweh. And so in your English translations, when you see Lord in most of your English translations, and you find this out by reading the front matter, it'll tell you how it translates Yahweh. So if it's Yahweh in most of your translations, not this one, it's going to be all capital letters. It's going to have capital L and then small caps for Lord. And that's how you know it's translating the Hebrew word Yahweh. If it's regular Lord in most translations, capital L, lowercase letters, it's translating a different name, a different reference to God, usually Adonai. But here, this translation does not follow the same rules. You would have to look at the front end to see what they do. But he says, "You are the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you." And so God is continuing to reveal himself to Moses and things about him. Not only is he I am, not only is he ever present, is he eternal, is he over all things, is he the one who causes things to be, but he's a God of generations. I'm the God of your fathers. I'm the God of Abraham. I'm the same God who revealed himself to Isaac. I'm the same God who revealed himself to Jacob. I'm the God of the generations before you. I'm the God of the promise. He goes on and he says, this God, the God of your fathers, has sent me to you. Moses, you're to go and tell him that Yahweh has sent me to you. God is a sending God. He didn't become a sending God with the Great Commission in the New Testament. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all that I commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the ends of the earth, the age. Now, he didn't just become a sending God then when Jesus came. God has always been a sending God. He comes to Moses and he says, I am sending you to deliver my people out of Egypt. You see, God created Adam and Eve, and the goal was to go be fruitful and multiply. I'm sending you out to represent me among all of creation, that you might represent me in the relationship with me that you have. Noah comes off the ark. Noah, I want you to be fruitful and multiply. No, I want you to do the same thing that I told Adam and Eve to do. Go and represent me. I'm sending you. Abraham, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make nations come out of you. And through you, Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Abraham, I'm going to work through you, but I want through you all the nations to be blessed. God is a sending God. Moses, I'm sending you to go and deliver my people. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial from generation to generation. Verse 16, go and bring together the elders of Israel and tell them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, appeared to me, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I have attended carefully to you and to what has been done to you in Egypt. So this is an important thing. Moses is going to go to these people who have been enslaved for 400 years, and he's going to say, Yahweh, the God of our fathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to come and rescue you. And the question in many of those minds is now? 400 years later, now? So Moses, it's important that you tell him, I have attended closely. I have observed. And this is a different way of him saying it than he said it before. You see, if you were to look up the word behind, I have attended carefully, or I've observed, or I've visited, depending on your translation, and you were to look that word up, that word's oftentimes accompanied with God's actions. I have seen, therefore I'm going to act. I have visited, which means I have come to you to intercede. God's saying to his people, I am going to act because I've seen and I've heard. Verse 17, I have promised that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. In other words, God's saying, I'm bringing you back into the land that I brought you out of. You see, you're currently not living in the land that I gave to Abraham, but I'm bringing you back there. Now, other people have moved in since then. I'm bringing you into that land. You know that land because it's where the Hittites live, the Jebusites live. It's where the Canaanites live. I'm bringing you into that land. Verse 18, the elders will listen to you. Then you and the elders of Israel must go to the king of Egypt. See, it'd be one thing if Moses just go to the elders, go to your people. He says, no, you're going to go to them, and then you guys are going to go to Pharaoh together. You must go to the king of Egypt and tell him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know, this is God, I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go, not even under force. So I will extend my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders. God is a God who overcomes those and that which opposes him. I will strike my Egypt with all my wonders that I will do among them, and after that he will release you. God is talking about the plagues that would come. Moses, I want you to go to Egypt. I want you to go to the Pharaoh and tell him, you need to let the people of Israel go so they can go worship their God in the desert. But Moses, I'm telling you up front, he's not going to do it. Now, this is really important when Moses thinks back and says, who am I, God? And God says, I will be with you. Because now God is saying, Moses, I want you to go to the king of Egypt. Egypt would have been the reigning empire at this time. I want you to go to the most powerful person in the world. And I want you to tell him to let his slave labor go. But Moses, he's not going to believe you, and he's not going to do it. Why would he do it? See, Pharaoh's heart's already hard. Pharaoh's heart, he is a god in his own mind. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Egypt, was the manifestation of the god Horus. He is a deity in and of himself. If he were to acknowledge any other god, then he is somehow less powerful. He's not going to do that. Moses, he's not going to do it unless he's compelled to do it. And so I'm going to stretch out my hand and I'm going to do wonders. And then and only then will he do it. God is a God who overcomes those and that which oppresses him. Which opposes him, but also oppresses him, if you could oppress God. 21, I will grant this people favor with the Egyptians so that when you depart, you will not leave empty-handed. Every woman will ask her neighbors and the one who happens to be staying in her house for items of silver and gold and for clothing. You will put these articles on your sons and daughters. Thus, you will plunder Egypt. God is a God who brings favor to his people. God is a God who, even in the midst of oppression, even when things are not going well, God is a God who brings favor to his people. I've prayed that prayer so many times in my young life at this point, and I'm sure I will pray it again. Anytime I've switched jobs, God, would you give me favor in this job? I hate starting over. Don't you hate starting over? I hate starting over. I got to prove myself all over again. I've got to start with no reputation in some cases. I've got to start from scratch. God, would you give me favor among this group of people? God, would you, if I'm staying at the same place but the team is changing, God, would you give me favor with this boss? God is a God who gives his people favor. So it's important when God says to Moses, I will be with you. That's who God is. He's ever present. He's over all things. He brings things into being. He's a God who delivers. I'm sending you to deliver my people. He's a God who brings favor. And so when God's presence is with you, it makes little difference who you are. You see, our problem is we get very self-focused. And we paralyze ourselves from doing things and following God and stepping out in faith because we're more concerned with why would they hire me? Why would they accept me? Why would they say yes to me? Why would they let me lead them? What do I have to invest in them? Who am I? But God's answer to your who am I is I will be with you. And that's what matters. If you're doing something that God has called you to do, God will be with you. Now, if you're blazing your own path and you're trying to slap God's name on it, he will not be with you in that. So be careful when you speak and you say, but God's with me in this, because not everything that we claim God is doing is God doing. There are lots of people that do things in the name of God, in the name of Christianity, in the name of Christ, or they speak in that name, and they don't represent the heart of God. And they don't say it in a way that represents the heart of God. So just because someone says that doesn't make it true. It's true if God is actually with you. And how will you know? Because you'll see the evidence. You'll see the fruit that only the Spirit of God can bring about. You'll see the doors that only God can open. You'll see doors close where they need to close. You will see God changing hearts as only God can do. You'll see marriages growing and strengthening as only God can do. You'll see parents growing and investing in their kids as only God can do. You'll see the workplace environment start to shift and change as only God can do. You'll see the fruit of the Spirit. And where you don't see fruit, perhaps it's because God is not there with you, working in that way. So some of you this morning, you're standing right on the edge transition life, big decision, and you're wrestling more with who am I, and this morning I think you need to wrestle more with who is God. God, what are you calling me to do? Where are you leading me? The Proverbs 16:9 says, the heart of man plans his ways, but the Lord directs his steps. God, guide my steps. God, I've got these desires, I've got these interests, but I want you to guide and direct my steps. You pray prayers like that, you surrender yourself to the Lord, and then you just step, and you walk one foot in front of the other, and you trust that the Lord is guiding you. It's not always going to be God revealing himself in a burning bush. In fact, Moses had been in that location for many different times. He was doing what he always did. The mundane, the daily, the changing diapers, the parenting the kids, the saying no, the saying yes, the asking, answering the questions of why, the taking the kids to the different events that they've got to go to, keeping up with their schedule, checking their homework, going to your job, staying at that, even if you don't like it, even if it bores you to tears. And sometimes you think, I should be doing something else. I want to be doing something else. It's in the mundane. It's in the things that we normally do that oftentimes God is going to reveal himself right in the midst of that. Are we looking for that? Are we curious about the things that God might be doing among us, in the areas that we're at? Because if we've lost our curiosity, then we're not looking for God. We're not looking for evidence of his Spirit at work. So God, where are you moving? What are you doing today in this place? What are you doing in that person's heart that you're asking me to go pray for? What are you doing in their life? Where God's presence is with you, it makes little difference who you are. And others of you this morning, the way you need to respond is perhaps consider that God is a sending God who sent Jesus to die for sinners as a demonstration of his love. He sent Jesus to die for sinners, not saints. God sent Jesus to die for people who were actively rebelling against him. And that is how God shows his love for us. Some of you need to hear that this morning because you're thinking, God can't love someone like me. In fact, he does love someone like you because he sent Jesus to die for sinners. That's the type of God that he is. He's a sending God, and he's a God who delivers. He brings his people out of enslavement. Some of you are trapped in sin. Some of you are giving your lives chasing things, desires, and things that maybe leave you satisfied for a moment, but ultimately leave you empty. Some of you are chasing things that you think that's the ultimate goal, and then you reach it, and you find out it's lonely up here, and that's it. And some of you are chasing things, and maybe you'll never hit it. But it will never satisfy you even if you did, because what you're chasing is actually a substitute for what God has designed and created you to know, and that's him. And that's why he sent Christ to die in the place of sinful people and rise from the dead, that we might respond to him by faith and believing in him, that we might have life and righteousness that Jesus himself earned, that we might know God and be known by God. We might be brought into his family. So this morning, let's ask the Lord, what do you have with my name on it this morning? How are you asking me to respond today? Let's let that settle.
Mercy is falling, falling. Lift up your hands, receive it now. Here in the presence of the Lord. Mercy is falling, falling. Lift up your hands, receive it now. Here in the presence of the Lord. I know your past is
Father, there is no place that we can go from your presence. There is no height that we can climb, no tops of mountains where you are not there, and no depths that we can descend where you are not there. And God, as your people gather together, as people who belong to Christ are gathered together, each individually bearing the presence of God because your Spirit is inside of us. And yet, God, as we gather together, your Spirit is present in a very unique way. And God, where your presence is, that's holy ground. Father, speak to the people that need to hear from you this morning. Make it clear that it's you. Encourage the people, God, this morning that need to be encouraged by you. For those, God, who need to be confronted, convicted, that need to be challenged by you, disciplined by you. Maybe they need that type of love this morning by you, God. Speak to them. God, for those who are living with pride, God, would you humble us? And as we depart from here, when we remember the words that Christ left for his followers, that all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, therefore go. And make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you. And remember, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. We say that in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. See you guys next week.